There is an old and simple rule that runs through nearly every story ever told about love given in the dark, that it cannot survive being looked at too closely, too soon, before trust has had time to grow into something sturdy enough to bear the light. This is the story of a woman who broke that rule out of fear and out of the poison of other people's doubt, and lost, in a single lamplit instant, the most extraordinary husband any mortal woman had ever been given. And it is the story of what she did afterward. For unlike so many of the tales we have followed on this channel, where a single mistake simply ends a life or ends a love forever, this one asks something rarer of its heroine. It asks her to go looking for what she lost, through trial after impossible trial, set by the one person in all the world who most wanted her to fail. Tonight we follow Psyche, whose name means, in the Old Greek, both the soul and the breath of life itself, down into a story that is really about exactly that, what the soul must endure and overcome before real love can finally be trusted to last. To find where this story begins, we must go, as we so often do, to Olympus, and to a goddess who could not bear to be second to anyone. There was once a mortal king with 3 daughters, and the youngest of them, Psyche, was so extraordinarily beautiful that word of her loveliness traveled far beyond her father's kingdom, until strangers began arriving from distant lands, simply to look upon her, and some among them, in the fervor of that admiration, began to whisper that she was more beautiful even than Aphrodite herself, the goddess of love and beauty, and began, in their foolish and dangerous devotion, to neglect the goddess's own temples and shrines in favor of admiring a mortal girl instead. It is worth pausing on how small and human the offense actually was, at its root, because the goddess's fury that followed was entirely out of proportion to anything Psyche herself had done. She had asked for none of this. She had built no temple to herself, demanded no worship, encouraged no comparison between her own ordinary mortal face and the face of an immortal goddess. She was simply beautiful, in the plain and passive way that beauty sometimes falls upon a person without their asking for it, and the whole catastrophe that followed grew entirely out of what other people chose to do with that beauty, and how a jealous goddess chose to punish her for it anyway. Aphrodite, hearing her own altars going cold while mortal crowds gathered instead to admire a king's daughter, was consumed with a fury she could not let pass unanswered, and she called for her own son, the winged god of desire himself, and gave him a task perfectly suited to a mother's wounded vanity. Her son was Cupid, or Eros, in the older Greek telling, though this particular story comes to us mostly in its later Roman shape, and so we will follow it by that name, the god whose golden arrows could kindle desire in anyone they struck, mortal or immortal alike, and whose leaden arrows could just as easily extinguish it. Aphrodite commanded him to fly down to the mortal world and find this presumptuous girl who dared to rival her own beauty, and strike her with one of his golden arrows in such a way that she would fall hopelessly and helplessly in love with the vilest, most wretched, most utterly unworthy creature that could be found anywhere in the world. A punishment designed not merely to hurt Psyche, but to humiliate her completely, to take the very beauty that had drawn so much undeserved worship and yoke it forever to something beneath contempt. Cupid, ever obedient to his mother, in the old tellings, if not always for very long, took up his bow and his quiver, and flew down to complete the task exactly as she had commanded. But when he found Psyche, and looked upon her for the first time with his own eyes, rather than through the jealous report of his mother's fury, something happened that neither Aphrodite nor Cupid himself had ever anticipated. In the old story, it is said that in the moment of aiming his arrow, distracted by the sheer and unexpected wonder of the girl he had been sent to punish, Cupid accidentally grazed himself with the point of his own weapon, and fell, in that single careless instant, hopelessly and completely in love with the very mortal he had been commanded to ruin. There is a lovely and quiet irony folded into that accident, worth sitting with for a moment before the story moves on, for it means that the god of desire itself, the very source of every arrow of longing ever loosed into any heart, in the whole of these old myths, was in the end no more in control of his own heart than any mortal he had ever struck. He could not now bring himself to carry out his mother's cruel command, and so, unwilling either to defy Aphrodite openly or to wound the woman he had already secretly fallen in love with, Cupid did something stranger and more roundabout instead. He arranged, through means the old story leaves carefully mysterious, that Psyche's own fate would take an unusual and unsettling turn, one that would eventually deliver her in the end entirely into his own hidden keeping. Meanwhile, back in her father's kingdom, Psyche's extraordinary beauty had begun to curdle into a very different and much lonelier kind of fate than her two elder sisters enjoyed. Both of her sisters, though lovely enough in their own right, had already married well, settled comfortably into respectable royal households, while Psyche, whose beauty everyone praised so extravagantly, found that no suitor ever actually came forward to ask for her hand at all. People admired her the way one admires a painting or a statue, from a careful and worshipful distance, and no one, it seemed, could quite bring themselves to imagine loving her as an ordinary wife, as though her beauty had placed her, somehow, beyond the reach of ordinary human affection entirely. Her father, troubled and bewildered by this strange and prolonged loneliness surrounding his most beautiful daughter, finally traveled to consult the oracle of Apollo, hoping for some guidance on how to find her a husband at last. And the answer the oracle gave him, when it came, filled the whole household with dread. Psyche was fated, the oracle declared, to marry no mortal man at all, but a fearsome and terrible creature that not even the gods themselves could withstand, a winged monster, who waited for her even now upon a distant mountaintop, and to whom she must be led, dressed in funeral garments rather than wedding clothes, and left alone at the mountain's peak to meet whatever fate awaited her there. It is worth noticing, before the story rushes onward into the strange marriage that follows, just how completely this oracle was shaped by Cupid's own hidden hand, working quietly through Apollo, whose oracle so often served, in these old tales, as the unseen mechanism by which the gods arranged the fates of mortals from a careful and untraceable distance. Psyche was never truly fated to marry any monster at all. She was fated, all along, to marry the god of desire himself, but delivered to that marriage through a prophecy dark and terrifying enough that no one, not her grieving family, and not Psyche herself, could have any reason to suspect the truth of what was actually waiting for her at the mountain's summit. And so, in a procession that more closely resembled a funeral than any wedding, Psyche was led up the mountain by her weeping family and the mourning crowds of her father's kingdom, dressed not in bridal white, but in the somber clothing of the dead, and left there alone, exactly as the oracle had commanded, to await whatever terrible bridegroom the gods had chosen for her. But no monster came. Instead, as Psyche sat trembling and alone on that windswept mountaintop, she felt herself lifted gently by a soft and invisible wind, Zephyrus, the west wind himself, sent by Cupid to carry her safely down from the exposed summit, and carried, drifting and weightless, down into a hidden valley below, where she found herself set gently upon soft grass beside the most extraordinary palace she had ever seen or imagined, its walls gleaming with gold, its floors set with precious stones, entirely unlike anything a mortal architect could ever have conceived or built. Exhausted and bewildered, she wandered through its silent halls, and found, without any visible servant ever showing themselves to her, that a feast had been laid out for her, invisible hands filling her cup the moment it emptied, unseen musicians filling the air with music the moment she paused to listen for it. Every comfort a lonely and frightened bride could want provided for her by attendants she could hear and feel, but never once see with her own eyes. And when night finally fell, and Psyche lay down at last, in the magnificent chamber prepared for her, her mysterious husband came to her in the darkness, his voice gentle and warm, his touch tender, and he told her, before anything else, the one condition upon which their whole marriage would depend. She could have every comfort this palace offered, every luxury, every kindness he could give her, and he would come to her every single night, faithfully, as her husband in every real sense of the word. But she must never, under any circumstance, attempt to look upon his face. She must never bring a lamp into their chamber while he was present, never try to see him by any light at all, and if she ever broke this single condition, everything between them, he warned her gently but firmly, would be lost forever. Psyche, frightened and confused, but genuinely charmed by the tenderness of a husband she could not see, agreed to his condition, and so began a strange and secluded marriage, days of solitary luxury in a palace of invisible servants, and nights spent in the company of a husband whose voice she came to love, long before she ever asked herself too closely why he refused so absolutely to let her see his face. For a time, this arrangement, strange as it was, brought Psyche something like genuine contentment. Her husband, whatever else remained hidden about him, was unfailingly gentle and devoted, and in the darkness of their nights, together, she found herself falling in love with a presence she knew almost entirely through touch and voice rather than sight. But loneliness, even a loneliness cushioned by every luxury a palace could provide, has a way of eating quietly at a person over time. And Psyche, missing her family and her old life, eventually begged her mysterious husband to allow her sisters to visit her, so that she might have some ordinary human company in her long, solitary days. Her husband, sensing danger in the request, in a way that Psyche herself could not yet fully understand, warned her carefully against it, telling her that her sisters, if they came, would fill her head with poison and doubt, and would very likely try to convince her to break the one condition upon which their entire marriage depended. But Psyche, lonely and persistent, pleaded until at last he relented, and allowed Zephyrus to carry her two sisters down into the hidden valley for a visit. And here the story turns, exactly as her husband had feared it would, on the oldest and most familiar of human weaknesses, not malice exactly, at least not at first, but envy, dressed up cleverly as concern. Psyche's sisters, arriving at the extraordinary palace, and seeing the unimaginable wealth and comfort their youngest sibling now lived in, luxury far beyond anything either of their own respectable marriages had provided them, felt something curdle inside them that had nothing to do with any real worry for Psyche's safety, and everything to do with a bitter and long-simmering jealousy of a sister who had always, since childhood, drawn more admiration than either of them ever had. When Psyche, in her innocent happiness, admitted that she had never actually seen her husband's face, her sisters seized on the detail with a predator's instinct, and began, patiently, and with the appearance of loving concern, to plant a terrible suspicion in her mind. Surely, they told her, a husband who refused ever to be seen must be hiding something monstrous. Perhaps he was the very serpent monster the oracle had originally warned of, fattening her now on luxury, only to devour her later, once she had grown too comfortable and too trusting to suspect the danger she was actually living inside. Notice how carefully this poison was administered, because it is worth understanding exactly why it worked on someone as genuinely happy as Psyche had, by this point, actually become. Her sisters did not simply accuse her husband of monstrosity outright, which Psyche, secure in her growing love for him, might well have dismissed. They planted a seed of doubt shaped precisely like love and concern, framing their poisonous suggestion as sisterly worry for her safety rather than the jealousy that actually drove it. And they left her alone afterward to let that seed grow entirely on its own, watered by nothing more than the ordinary human fear of the unknown, and by a husband's own stubborn and unexplained secrecy, which, however gently meant, had never actually been secure enough to survive the introduction of real doubt from outside their strange and isolated marriage. Psyche, left alone that night, her mind now full of serpents and monsters, where there had once been only trust, made the fateful decision her husband had feared from the very beginning. She hid a small oil lamp and a sharp knife in their chamber, resolved that when he fell asleep beside her that night, she would finally light the lamp and look upon his true face at last. And, if her sister's warning proved true, she would use the knife to defend herself before he could devour her. That night, when her husband had fallen into a deep and peaceful sleep beside her, Psyche rose quietly, lit the hidden lamp, and turned its small flame toward the sleeping figure in her bed, the knife trembling in her other hand, braced for whatever monster her sisters had convinced her she would find. And there, in the soft and unsteady lamplight, she saw not a serpent, and not any kind of monster at all, but the most beautiful being she had ever beheld, Cupid himself, god of desire, his golden curls spread across the pillow, his great feathered wings folded gently at his sides, so extraordinarily beautiful in his sleep that Psyche, overcome by wonder and by shame, at her own doubt in equal measure, nearly forgot to breathe. In her trembling astonishment, examining the quiver of arrows that lay beside the bed, she accidentally pricked her own finger on one of the golden arrowheads within, and fell, in that same instant, even more deeply and helplessly in love with her sleeping husband than she had ever been before, wounded, fittingly enough, by the very same kind of weapon that had first bound the two of them together in the beginning, though she did not yet understand that particular irony. But her trembling hand, overwhelmed by the beauty she had finally uncovered, let a single drop of hot oil fall from the lamp she still carried, and it landed upon Cupid's bare shoulder, burning him and waking him instantly from his sleep. And in that single unbearable moment, everything Psyche had built across all those secluded and happy nights came apart at once. Cupid, waking to find his wife standing over him with a lit lamp in one hand and a knife in the other, understood immediately and completely what had happened, that she had broken the one condition he had asked of her, out of fear planted by others rather than any true doubt of her own, and that the trust their whole strange marriage had depended upon was now by the very terms he had warned her of from the very first night, broken beyond any simple mending. Without a word of anger, but without staying to be reasoned with either, he spread his wings and flew from the chamber and from the palace entirely, leaving Psyche alone, weeping, clinging desperately to his leg as he rose into the night sky, until she could hold on no longer and fell back to the earth, and calling out after him uselessly into the dark as he vanished from her sight, leaving behind him not the monstrous cruelty her sisters had warned her of, but simply a broken promise and a wound of his own that would take a very long time to heal. Psyche, in her despair, first turned her anger toward the sisters, whose poisonous jealousy had cost her everything, and in a moment of grief-driven cruelty that the story does not shy away from, she deceived each of them in turn into believing that Cupid now wished to marry them instead, and that they need only leap from the very same mountain cliff where she herself had once been left as a bride for the wind to carry them safely down to him. A lie that led both sisters, driven by the very same jealousy that had destroyed Psyche's own happiness, to leap eagerly from the cliff and fall to their deaths with no gentle west wind waiting below to catch either of them. It is a dark and uncomfortable turn in a story that otherwise reads so much like a fairy tale, and it is worth letting it stand exactly as uncomfortable as it is, rather than softening it, because it tells us something true about grief and betrayal that the rest of the story does not otherwise say quite so plainly. That even a heroine as gentle and as sympathetic as Psyche was not immune to being reshaped, at least for one dark and understandable moment, by the very same cruelty that had already been used against her. But grief for a lost love, however it began, could not be answered by revenge alone, and Psyche, having lost the extraordinary palace and the invisible comforts, and, above all, the husband she now understood, she had genuinely and deeply loved, set out on foot across the world to search for him, wandering from temple to temple, from country to country, praying to every god she could think of for some help in finding her way back to him. And it was here, in the long and exhausting search that followed, that Aphrodite, who had never forgotten her original fury at a mortal girl who had once dared to rival her own beauty, and who was now doubly enraged to learn that her own son had disobeyed her explicit command and fallen in love with the very girl she had meant to humiliate, finally caught up with the wandering and desperate Psyche, and delivered upon her the full weight of a mother-in-law's wrath, rather than any welcome at all. Aphrodite declared that Psyche would never be permitted to see Cupid again, who now lay recovering from his burned shoulder in his mother's own house, unless she could first prove herself worthy of him by completing a series of tasks. Tasks that Aphrodite designed, quite deliberately, to be entirely and completely impossible for any mortal woman to survive. The first task Aphrodite set before her was simple to describe, and by any ordinary reckoning, hopeless to complete. She led Psyche to an enormous storeroom filled with a chaotic and impossibly mixed mountain of grain, wheat and barley and millet and lentils and poppy seed, all jumbled together in a single vast heap, and commanded her to sort every single seed into its own separate pile before nightfall, or face a punishment the goddess did not need to spell out any further. Psyche, looking at the impossible mountain of mixed grain before her, sat down in despair, certain that no mortal hands could ever sort so vast and hopeless a task in the few hours of daylight remaining to her. But she was not, it turned out, entirely without allies in this trial, however invisible they remained to Aphrodite's own eyes. Word of her plight, some telling say, through Cupid's own quiet intervention, even in his mother's house, had reached the ants of the field, tiny and easily overlooked creatures that no proud goddess would ever think to consider a threat to her plans. And they came in their countless thousands, working with a patient and tireless industry no single pair of human hands could ever have matched. And by the time Aphrodite returned that evening, expecting to find Psyche's task hopelessly unfinished, she found instead every single seed sorted perfectly into its own neat and separate pile. Aphrodite, furious that the girl had somehow completed an impossible task, refused to believe that any mortal ingenuity had accomplished it alone, and set Psyche a second trial the very next day, one aimed less at patience this time, and more at sheer physical danger. Across the river lived a flock of golden-fleeced sheep, fierce and dangerous creatures whose wool shone like the sun itself, and Aphrodite commanded Psyche to go and gather a hank of that golden fleece and bring it back to her by evening. But these were no ordinary sheep, and their golden wool was guarded jealously by a temper as sharp as any weapon. For the creatures were known to charge and gore to death any who came too near them in the heat of the day, when their fury ran hottest. Psyche, standing at the river's edge and looking across at the golden and dangerous flock, nearly despaired again, certain that approaching them directly would mean her death. Until the soft voice of a green reed growing at the water's edge, moved to pity by her evident despair, whispered a gentler solution to her. "Wait," the reed told her, "until the heat of the afternoon has passed, and the fierce sheep have grown calm and settled in the cool of the evening shade, and then simply gather the loose tufts of golden wool that catch and cling to the briars and low branches at the edge of their pasture, rather than approaching the dangerous flock directly at all." Psyche did exactly as the reed advised, and returned to Aphrodite that evening with her arms full of gleaming golden fleece, gathered without ever once needing to risk the sheep's fury directly. Twice thwarted, and twice more convinced that some hidden hand must be helping the girl she had meant to see utterly and completely defeated, Aphrodite devised a third task crueler and stranger than either of the first two. She handed Psyche a crystal vessel and commanded her to climb to the very source of the river Styx, high on a sheer and treacherous mountain crag, where the black water poured down through jagged and impassable rock, guarded by fearsome serpents, coiled along every ledge, and to fill the vessel with water from that deadly and sacred source and bring it back to her unspilled. It was a task that seemed, on the face of it, to offer no possible path to success at all. The crag too steep for any climber, the serpents too watchful to slip past, the black water itself sacred to a river. Even the gods swore their most unbreakable oaths upon and rarely dared to approach carelessly. But Psyche was not entirely without friends among the greater powers of the world either. However humble her mortal state made her seem to a wrathful goddess, and Zeus's own eagle, who owed Cupid a debt of gratitude from an earlier service the god of desire had once done for him, swept down from the heavens, took the crystal vessel gently from her trembling hands, and flew the terrible course past the serpents and the sheer rock himself, filling it at the deadly source and bringing it back to her safely, so that she might carry it to Aphrodite exactly as commanded. By now 3 impossible tasks, completed against every reasonable expectation, Aphrodite's fury had curdled into something colder and more determined, and she set Psyche a 4th and final trial. One meant, quite explicitly this time, to end in the girl's death rather than merely her failure. She commanded Psyche to travel down into the underworld itself, to the very kingdom of Hades and Persephone, and to ask the queen of the dead for a small portion of her own beauty, sealed inside a box, which Psyche was to carry back up to the world of the living without ever once opening it along the way, no matter what temptation or curiosity might arise during the journey. It was, in every sense, a journey no living mortal was meant to survive, let alone return from successfully, and Psyche, standing at the edge of that final and most terrible task, very nearly gave up entirely, climbing to the top of a high tower, with the clear intention of throwing herself from it, and ending her suffering through the swiftest death available to her, since walking willingly into the underworld seemed no less certain a death in the end. But the tower itself, in one final and unexpected mercy, spoke to her, and gave her precise and detailed instructions for how a living mortal might actually survive the passage down into Hades' kingdom and back again, which coins to carry for the ferryman Charon, which cakes to bring to placate the great hound Cerberus at the gates, and above all, the same warning her whole story had already taught her so painfully once before. Whatever she was given by Persephone, however curious she became about its contents, she must never, under any circumstance, open the box along her journey home. Guided by these instructions, Psyche made the descent and paid the ferryman, and calmed the great three-headed hound, and came at last before Persephone herself, who received her request with more grace and sympathy than Aphrodite ever had, and filled the box exactly as asked, and sent her back up toward the world of the living with the danger, it seemed, finally and fully behind her. But here, so very close to the completion of the very last and hardest of her trials, Psyche's own curiosity, the same fatal curiosity that had once driven her to light a lamp over a sleeping husband, rose up in her one final time. Surely, she reasoned, carrying a portion of divine beauty across so long and hard a journey, it could do no harm to take just the smallest touch of it for herself, to repair whatever weariness and hardship her long ordeal had worn into her own face, so that she might appear worthy, at last, in front of the husband she still hoped, somewhere beyond all this suffering, to be reunited with. And so close to the very end of her trials, she opened the box. But what lay inside was no beauty at all. It was a deep and death-like sleep, a trick of Persephone's own devising, or perhaps simply the true and terrible nature of whatever lay in the underworld's keeping. And the moment the box was opened, that sleep poured out and overtook Psyche entirely, and she collapsed upon the road, motionless and beyond waking. Her whole long journey and every trial she had already survived brought, in a single unguarded instant, to what seemed a final and permanent end. It would be easy, and it would be entirely understandable, for this story to end here, with a heroine undone one final time by the same flaw that had already cost her everything once before. But this story, unlike so many of the tragedies we have followed on this channel, was never actually built to end in ruin. For Cupid, healed now from his burned shoulder, and having spent the whole length of Psyche's long trials, missing her more than his own wounded pride could bear to admit, had at last slipped free of his mother's house, and flew out across the world searching for her, and found her there upon the roadside, lost in that death-like underworld sleep, and gently wiped the sleep away from her closed eyes, and gathered her back into consciousness with nothing more than his own touch. And this time there was no lamp and no hidden knife, and no doubt planted by anyone else's jealousy, standing between them. Cupid carried Psyche up to Olympus itself, and pleaded with Zeus, king of all the gods, to grant his mortal wife true and lasting immortality, so that she might live beside him forever as an equal, rather than a fragile mortal bride, vulnerable to every fresh trial his own mother might still devise against her. And Zeus, moved by the devotion the god of desire himself had shown for this one mortal woman across so long and difficult a courtship, agreed, and gave Psyche a cup of ambrosia, the food of the gods, to drink. And in that single divine draught she became immortal, and was welcomed at last into the full and permanent company of Olympus. Even Aphrodite, seeing that her son's devotion could not be broken by any trial she devised, and perhaps recognizing, in her own way, that a love which had survived quite so much genuinely deserved to endure, made her peace with the marriage at last, and the wedding of Cupid and Psyche was celebrated on Olympus itself, among gods and mortals both, with a joy that none of the long trials before it had ever once promised was actually still possible. And so we return at the very end to the question this whole long and winding story was quietly built to ask. Why must love so often, in these old tales, pass through trial and doubt and even outright betrayal before it can finally be trusted to last? Psyche's own name gives us the answer, if we listen closely enough for it, for she is, in the oldest Greek understanding of that word, the soul itself, and her whole long journey, from a lamp lit too soon out of fear, through jealousy and grief, and impossible labor, and even a descent into death itself, is really the journey every soul must make before it can finally hold, without flinching and without doubting, the love that desire alone first offered it. Cupid could strike her with his arrow in a single careless instant, the same instant he struck himself. But it took every single one of her trials afterward: the sordid grain, the golden fleece, the black water of the Styx, the box from the land of the dead, before that first careless spark of desire could finally be trusted to hold the far harder and far more lasting weight of real devotion. Real love, this story insists, gently but completely, is not the thing you feel the moment an arrow first finds you. It is the thing that survives every doubt that comes afterward, and returns again and again, however far it must wander, and however deep it must descend, to find its way back to the one it was always meant for. Rest now. Let the long road Psyche walked finally led somewhere soft and golden, up beyond every trial, into a hall where a husband once lost in the dark waits now in the light, with nothing left between them any more, but the quiet and finally trusted peace of love that has already proven, beyond any doubt at all, that it was always going to last.